One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Okay, we are doing a follow-up to the previous episode, 300, where I gave you the 5 keys to repurposing your content. And I really wanted to throw these questions into that episode, but to be totally honest, I felt like, oh my gosh, this episode is already over 30 minutes. It's going to be 2 hours if I throw in these questions. So that's what I wanted to do today. I wanted to have a chance to sit down, go back over some of the questions that I had at the She Podcast conference and some of the ones that trickled in after the talk was given. They have this cool app where people could submit questions beforehand and we could communicate and go back and forth. And I had a few before the talk happened, and then I had some afterwards. So we are going to go on a deeper dive into specific questions around repurposing your content. So let's get right to it. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been trying to figure out the world of podcasting, think of this show as the time-saving shortcut you've been looking for. So let's get right to it, shall we? So I'm not going to waste any time. We are just going to dive into the questions that we had about repurposing content. If you want to know more about how to do content repurposing at a higher level, I really suggest going back and listening to the previous episode. Just go one episode back where I dive into what it means to repurpose a piece of content, because today I'm diving into the specific questions that I know will help the broader audience. And for those of you that are just getting into content creation, I want these questions to really spark some ideas and inspirations that you can use for your own show. So I want to give a quick shout out to all of the attendees of the She Podcast conference that came to my talk. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your fantastic questions. And I'm going to give some people some shout outs today. So Cheryl is up first. And Cheryl's question was, do you have any tips and tricks to finding great sound bites and remembering where the sound bites are without having to listen to the whole podcast again? Thanks. So this is a great question, Cheryl. And what I like to do in finding different snippets of the podcast, I love to have a really good outline whenever I'm recording my show, right? If you've been around here for a while, you know that I love Asana. I love Google Sheets. Whenever I am trying to keep my content calendar really organized. And so even right now, as I'm talking to you, right, I'm speaking into this microphone, I have Asana pulled up in front of me with all the different questions that were asked at the conference and after the talk that I gave. So I constantly have some type of notes in front of me, whether they're in a notebook, they're on a Post-it note, like wherever. I typically have notes in front of me whenever I'm recording. And if I make a really great point that I'm like, oh, I really want listeners to hear that, I will make a mental note of, hey, I know that I said this. It was either a soapbox moment or it was something that I know that my audience needed to hear. So whenever I go back and I edit the podcast, I will get those timestamps from the final audio file. Right? Because even like as I'm recording right now, if I were to look down and say, oh, it's been 4 minutes and 17 seconds, is it going to be that exact same timestamp whenever I go to do my final edits? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how much editing you do on your own show, but at least you can have kind of a gauge of where it is when you're recording, and you can make a note of that as soon as you're finished. But that's kind of a lot. That's a lot to do while you're recording. So what I like to do is after I'm done recording, I'm editing, I will make a note of around where that episode or that snippet was. Was it at the beginning, in the middle, at the end? And that cuts down on trying to find just that perfect piece of audio. But also, I know what points, like whenever I'm recording this, will be most impactful for my audience. And that's not something that's really translatable from show to show, right? Like you will know what your audience wants to know about. And if you don't, you need to dive deeper into the engagement of understanding who your audience is and like just getting to know them better. So when I create sound bites, I'm trying to find those little nuggets that I know will pique their interest enough to go get them to listen to the whole episode. And I talked about this a lot at the She Podcast conference, but I think it's really important that we start getting into the mindset of what are my listeners doing at the point of before they're actually listening? So this is a current listener or a potential listener. What are they doing right before they go listen to my show? Is it out of habit? That's like the highest, like holy grail of marketing of what we want them to do, right? That is like, oh, it's Wednesday. I know, there's a new podcast episode. I got to go listen to it right now. This is my habit for listening to the Office Ladies podcast. Y'all know I've talked about it before. It's my favorite podcast. I know technically I think it comes out on Tuesday, but habitually it fits into my schedule to listen to it on Wednesday because that's when I have set aside time in my weekly calendar. I'm like, I normally go run on Wednesdays or, I'm active around the house. So I'll have an opportunity to listen to it. That is the holy grail of getting people to listen to your podcast. It's just baked into their routine. But if you're not there yet with your listeners, you have to say, how can I grab their attention and get them to listen to the full episode? So these are posts on social media, emailing them, like different touch points for you to get in front of them without having to give the whole thing away. You want it to be just enough that it's not annoying, it's super short, and it will grab their attention really fast. So I don't think that just putting the introduction, right? If you say the same thing over and over again, I don't think that's a good hook to get them in. I think it should be something enticing. If you have an interview, like maybe something your guest says that's like, oh, like let's give them just a taste of what they can expect in this episode. And honestly, I'll listen to shows where they tease out the best part of the episode. And I think, man, if that part's good, I want to go listen to the rest of it. So these are some of the things that I want you to think about when you create your sound bites. So number one, do it whenever you're editing your show, you're re-listening to it, make a little note, doesn't have to be fancy, y'all, on a little piece of paper. Just say, hey, this is something they should listen to. And the second thing to think about is, what do they really want to hear that will get them to listen to the full episode? So great question, Cheryl. The next question that I have is from Catherine. So Catherine asks, should you ever repost old episodes? How do you reuse that content? So I have a different perspective than other podcasters in our industry. I am not a fan of repurposing old episodes in just like a copy and paste or a replay or revisited episode. And there's a very specific reason why, and it comes from my own experience as a fan of other podcasts. If I'm a loyal listener of a podcast, right? I've been listening to it maybe from the very beginning, or I found it and I devoured every single episode, and now I'm an active listener of any new piece of content that comes out. I get really disappointed when a host re-airs an episode that I've already listened to.
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants.
Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
I do. And I know that, when you put out a piece of content, you're not just serving your loyal listeners, you're serving brand new people. But I don't like the idea of, oh, this episode's already been out. I've already heard this. This goes back to me having the show baked into my weekly habits. I haven't missed an episode of The Office Ladies. And they've done this a few times where they've re-aired old episodes. And I just always get disappointed. I mean, I get why they do it. They're like, oh, we're on vacation. We're on a holiday. We're spending time with our family. These are legitimate reasons to make that happen. But as a listener, I always get bummed out. I'm like, I've already heard this. I know what this is. So it's just a little disappointing to hear the same thing, because I'm not going to re-listen to the same episode again because I've already heard it. So that's my take on reposting it. Now I'm going to kind of flip the script for a second. I am a fan of taking a successful piece of content and either going deeper on one specific point that you made in an episode, or maybe you take a fresh perspective. So let's go back to the last episode that I just aired, right? We talked about the 5 keys to repurposing your podcast content. If I wanted to, I could pick the know your plan element. I think that was number 3. I could take that and I could go even deeper, like how to create a plan for repurposing your podcast content. And I could just create a whole episode about that. That's actually a really good idea. Hang on, let's write that down, because that's something that we do need to do, because ever since I started talking about repurposing content, everybody's eyes are lighting up like, yes, we want more of this. Yes, please. So if you have more questions about it, don't hesitate to send me a DM on Instagram. I want to know what your questions are. Or if you're on our emails, you get a weekly email, just hit reply to any of those and say, hey, I have a question about this. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions about repurposing content, especially because I know it will be so different for everybody. And not everyone creates content in the same way and across the same platforms. So, but let's go back to, instead of just taking an old episode and airing it again, I think that it would be really cool if you could just take the same concept, put a fresh spin on it, maybe a different story, a fresh perspective, or like I said, going deeper on one specific point that you made in an episode. And this is especially true for those of you that do a lot of teaching or education. I know that I've listened to podcasts that are, people in our profit podcasting programs and coaching calls that I've done where they'll have like, oh, here's the 10 steps to live a better life or have a more organized home, like whatever it is. Why don't you, instead of just doing 10 steps, you could do that episode, but then also say, okay, we're going to go really deep on step number 4 because I see a lot of people struggling with that. So this is another way that you could repurpose old pieces of content. Take a concept you already covered and put a fresh spin on it. So great question. I can't talk today, y'all. I've had other issues where it comes out like baby speak. I said something earlier. I meant to say little and it came out whittle. So I don't know. I don't know what's happening today, but I apologize. Catherine, great question. So glad you asked this. Hannah, this was your question. I'd love to learn about the difference between reusing the actual episode and also reusing specific content from within the episode and the benefits of each. So this is a really good question. And I think that this was something that was kind of a spinoff. And this is just my take on it. So Hannah, if you're listening and you had a different perspective, you're like, oh, that wasn't part of my question, let me know. But the way that I interpreted this was thinking of using the actual episode, meaning maybe you had video and audio together. And I like the perspective of using those together, but you have to remember which type of content each platform prefers or which one they like to cater to. So most podcast listeners don't want to go to YouTube and watch an hour-long podcast episode, right? Like, let's just be totally honest. This audience for my show, y'all don't have hours and hours of your time to sit down and watch podcast episodes. Watch me. Like if I had a camera on me right now and I'm recording podcast episodes, what would make that any different? Because I'm not doing anything special, y'all. I mean, I have hair and my makeup done today, but other than that, there's nothing special going on. Like if there was a camera on me, you would just see me looking at my notes, talking into a microphone. There's no screen sharing. I'm not doing a demonstration. I'm literally just talking in my office. And I think about the podcast I listen to, even my favorite ones, even the Office Lady ones. I don't know that I'd want to sit down and watch those. I don't. I mean, unless there's something really, really special going on, they're singing and dancing and something like more entertaining. I don't know that I want to watch those conversations. So I think that reusing the actual episode or using like specific pieces like within the episode, I love it when, especially for those of you that are recording video and audio together, because a lot of people are starting to do this more. I think what you can do, and I recently started doing this on my YouTube channel, and I have a few examples for you to go check out. I'll link to them in the show notes, but I think it's better to take clips from your video interview and post that on YouTube or on other pieces of social media. So what I mean by this is like I think the first one I did was my interview with Amy Porterfield. I wanted to have video clips that I could put out on YouTube, and I put 2 of them out there. And what I did is I took snippets of the longer interview that we had on this podcast, and I was like, what is a question that I know people are like dying to know, either from Amy or about digital courses or having an online business? And I took those pieces, put them out on YouTube. They're short clips. I think they might have been 5 or 7 minutes. And I put those on YouTube with a graphic at the end that says, listen to the rest on the Profit Podcast, because I'm just teasing it out there. I'm also answering that question for people that are looking it up on YouTube, but I'm also giving them extra resources by saying, hey, if you want to know more about this, go listen to the whole podcast. So there is a big difference between reusing the whole episode and just reusing pieces of it. So I hope that answers your question, Hannah, but if you have other ones, let me know. So Carolyn has 2 questions. The first one is, what content repurposed to YouTube works well for a podcast? And that's really kind of what we just covered. So for Carolyn or anybody else that's listening and you're like, I really want to do YouTube, but should I do YouTube and a podcast, or should I do one first? Or, how should I make this work? In my experience, I tried to record videos that I would later turn into podcast episodes, and it did not work well for me. And by that, I mean, I am legitimately looking at my notes in Asana right now as I'm recording this. I have notes in front of me. I have previously looked at my journal, my notebook, and that's what I'm looking at. But whenever I record my YouTube videos, I want to look directly in the camera. And I don't have a teleprompter. I don't have a huge screen where I can have everything displayed. And maybe I'm just not, a news anchor. I'm not to that level yet of being able to know every single point I wanted to make without ever having to look at my notes. So I think that what works really well is for you to first record a podcast episode and then think about recording it on YouTube. And what I mean by that is your podcast episode is kind of like your trial run, right? It's like your dress rehearsal. You have your script in front of you if you have really detailed notes or a detailed outline, and you can read everything because no one sees it, right? Like y'all can't see me. Y'all can't see all the notes that I have in front of me, but maybe you're like, man, Crystal really knows what she's talking about. I do most of the time, except for when I start trying to use elaborate words. And then it's like, why? Why are you doing this? Just stick to your baby talk. Like you're mispronouncing things. That's what you do really well, right? So I have notes in front of me. But when I do my YouTube videos and it's about a piece of content that I've already talked about on the podcast, I feel more confident doing it on video because I've already practiced it. It's not my very first time talking about that content because I've already created an entire podcast episode about it, or maybe 2 or maybe 3. So by the time I am ready to record a video, I'm like, oh, okay, I don't need as many notes right in front of me. I don't have to retake and reshoot a whole bunch of videos. I pretty much know what I want to say in a YouTube video. So I think what you can do really well, because shorter videos tend to work really good on YouTube, is take a piece of content that's really successful on your podcast first and then decide, do I want to pare this down and trim an existing interview or an episode that you did record on video, or do I want to, take pieces of it, use that as my outline, and then create a video for it? So great question, Carolyn. And her second question that she has is, if you use audiogram clips for IG posts, is that successful? Yes, yes, and yes. And the reason why I say it's successful is not from my own perspective on, oh, my podcast gets millions of downloads because I post an audiogram on Instagram. No, that's definitely not what happens. I don't get millions of downloads, but I can tell you it works for me as a consumer, as a listener. When I see other podcasts that I follow, they post things on Instagram, it works on me. Y'all, it works on me almost every time. I will see someone's audiogram. I don't even have to listen to it. I don't have to have the sound on. I will see the artwork, or I'll see the WAV file moving, and I'll see all these things. And I'm like, oh, fantastic. There's another episode of that podcast out. I totally forgot it was Thursday. I need to go listen to that show. So I think it works from the perspective it's keeping your marketing top of mind with your audience. They see that and they immediately have this notification sent to their brain, oh yeah, I need to go listen to that podcast episode. So I believe it works from a listener's perspective because that's my consuming behavior, but also from the host perspective. I get comments. What I will do is I will create I use Buzzsprout to create my sound bites. I have a YouTube video I'll link to in the show notes. I don't think I've told you the show notes. So the show notes for this episode are crystalprofit.com/episode 301. I'm going to link to a YouTube video where I show you how I create these audiograms or sound bites in Buzzsprout. So what I'll do, I'll create them. They're up to 60 seconds long, and it goes in my Instagram feed with like a short caption. Then I reshare that, not from the feed, right? So stick with me for a second. For Instagram folks that know what I'm talking about, I don't share it in my stories from my feed. What I will do is I will download the soundbite. This is like literally the exact process. So I download it from Buzzsprout and I drag it over into my Google Drive. And the reason why I do that is because that allows me to download that video on my phone, and I will upload it to my stories after I've downloaded it from my phone, from my Google Drive. So I have all these sound bites I need to go and delete off my phone because I already have them in my Google Drive. I don't need them anymore. And Instagram, Google Drive, if you're listening, please make it some type of integration where I don't have to download all these things to my phone. I just want to share it. Why is this so hard? Why do we have to download so many things like all the time? Okay, I'm off my rant. But I think it's important that you share it on your feed, share it in your stories, but don't just share from your post, right? If you're looking at your grid on Instagram, don't just go to where you share it because it will just share it as a video file that you have to click on to play it. You just want to share the entire Instagram or the entire, soundbite into your stories. That way people can listen to it without having to press play. So that was a little Instagram deep dive. I hope that made sense, but reach out if y'all have any more questions. But great questions, Carolyn. All right, 3 more that we have here. So Brenda asked, could you talk more about how to batch create podcast and what to be thinking about ahead of time in relation to repurposing those episodes? So Brenda, if you're listening, I'm going to link to a YouTube video I did about batching podcasts. Now, it's not going to tell you all about repurposing those batched podcast episodes, but it's going to, and I've had more questions about batching. So this is like a red flag for me. It's like, oh, you need to create more content, video content about batching. I've talked about it several times on the podcast, but I think I need to show more of the behind the scenes of how these systems work for my show. But okay, so talk about more about batching podcast and what to be thinking of ahead. Hang on. I'm just totally botching this all over the place. What to be thinking about ahead of time in relation to repurposing those episodes. So, Brenda, I kind of talked about this in the last episode. When I went to She Podcast, I knew in October, and this happened actually in Q3 when I was planning, well, what am I going to do in October, November, December? I looked at all the different events, the different promotions, the different things that I had going on in the last quarter of the year. And I said, oh, this is fantastic. I can actually repurpose a lot of this content. So I'm taking time. I spent hours creating the talk that I did at She Podcast. There was no way I was going to let all of this just be spoken to once in a group of people and never be talked about again. Like, keep it a secret. No, I didn't sign anything with Jessica and Elsie where they were like, you cannot use this information anywhere else. No, I didn't. And honestly, I don't know that I would want to go to conferences and events where they tell you absolutely cannot share. This is like private, what's the word? Oh, see, this is what happens to me. I start thinking of words proprietary. I think that's the right word. I'm thinking about on Shark Tank, right? Proprietary information. I like to be able to share my content across different places. So whenever I am batch creating mini episodes, I think, how can I use this more than once? Is this also a podcast and a YouTube video? Is this something that I should do a live stream about? Or is this something I could do a live stream about first and then turn it into a podcast episode and chop it up and turn it into YouTube videos and chop it up even further and turn it into social post? So Brenda, this is going to look different for everybody, but I think when you're planning ahead to batch podcast episodes, ask yourself, is there a way I can reuse this content in the future? And this is something to note, especially for those of you who have seasonality to your business and your podcast. I think that it's fantastic if you can recreate something that you've done in the past. So something that I've done every year for the last 2 years is talk about some of my top books that I've read. And I'll do this at the end of the year. It's like, hey, these are my top books of 2019, my top books of 2020. I will do another one for my top books of 2021. And it's just something fun that I do every year. So I already started thinking, What do I want to share this year? What's something that's going to be on my list? So in looking ahead, like you can look backwards to see what's worked previously, and that kind of gives you an idea of what to think about whenever that time comes around next year or it comes around in the next quarter. So just always be thinking, what do you have promotional wise going on? What's something that you can reuse if you think, oh man, this is going to be a really awesome summit. I know I have a lot of friends that speak on summits, and maybe you don't get the audio and maybe you don't get the video from that summit, but I would think that you'd still be able to recreate that talk or recreate snippets of it. Or if you have great Q&A sessions, how can you use that? That's legitimately what I'm doing right now. I did a talk, right? That was episode 300. I recreated that talk for the podcast because I spent hours creating the actual talk. I'm going to get the most out of it. Then I'm literally using the questions from that talk to create another podcast episode. And you can bet your bottom dollar that I'm going to be using this for YouTube videos as well because the content is so good. And you are the only person that's going to be able to know, is this content good enough to reshare, recreate it, and get the most mileage out of it? So great question, Brenda. So Saria, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I wasn't sure if it was Saria or Soraya, asked, what resources, if any, are available out there to learn more about listener habits? This was a really interesting question, and it got me thinking. I know that there are some stats that Edison Research puts out, and I hopefully will find them and put them in the show notes. I didn't have a chance to look for them before this, but that's a great place to start. I know that every year they publish their articles like, so many people listen in the car, and so many people listen on like a listening device or a tablet or a phone. Like they put out those kind of statistics as far as it's like industry wide. But if you want to know what your listeners are doing, ask them. Just ask them. You can send out a survey. You can poll them on Instagram. You can just send an email and say, hit reply to this. And, I have this short survey. It's like 3 questions. There's different ways that you can do it. You can put a poll in your Facebook group. But I think one of the best things to do is be observant and be self-aware of your own habits. Like I said earlier, like I love The Office Ladies, and I am so entrenched in that world of the podcast, and I love listening to it. So I pay attention to my own habits. I love listening to the show on Wednesday mornings when I go on my workout, I go on my run. This is just something that I know about myself. So I ask myself, is this what my listeners are doing? And if I don't know, if I genuinely am like, I have no idea what my listeners are doing, that's when I start taking polls. That's when I start digging a little deeper. And I remember taking this course in college that was all about marketing research. And it was so fun to me. It was so interesting to see what the consumer behavior habits were of, different types of buyers and what they did and how that worked. But it all kind of started with just asking people, sending out a survey, right? Hey, what do you do? Like, do you go to one podcast app and binge listen to all of the previous week's episodes? Do you listen to it whenever it comes out that day? Just start with what you do yourself. Start asking your audience, and then ask your friends and family members that listen to podcasts. Even if it's not the same ones, even if they don't listen to your show, say, what makes you listen to a podcast? Do you just instinctively pull out your phone and there's a notification so you listen to it? Or do you go and search for new episodes? Just start asking more questions about listener habits. But this is a great question, and I'm actually curious to know this as well. So I'm going to be digging deeper into listener habits and putting together a survey to understand more about our audience here. And maybe that would be helpful information for other people in the community. Okay, the last question I see is from Bonnie. And Bonnie says, do you use audiograms for anything other than podcast? Which I thought was a great question because I'd never really thought about it. And I'm trying to think of a few ways that I could see audiograms working really well is if you have an audiobook. So I have an audiobook for Start a Binge-Worthy Podcast. You can get it on Audible. And if I wanted to, I could take clips from the book that I recorded and, slap a graphic up there and create some sound bites that way. So that would be a cool way to use audiograms. You could also use it for private podcast. So I'm going to be doing some content in the future about private podcast and how to use them as a lead generator in your business to get people on your email list or get new customers or just get, new leads for your business without it being something that's public for the whole world to see. People have to self-select into these private podcasts, but you could absolutely do audiograms for that as well. And you could do it for your YouTube channel, I guess, if you wanted to use your cover art or something like that. But when I think about YouTube, I always think about video, like video with the actual person on it or graphics or animation. So I don't really know how that would play into it, but I love the idea of audiograms for audiobooks or other types of content that I think you could get really creative with. But that's all I have for you today. So if you have more questions about repurposing your content, I want to know. I want you to reach out to me on Instagram. I'm at Crystal Profit TX, Crystal with the K, Profit with 2 Fs, 2 Ts, TX like Texas. And I want you to reach out to me. Send me a DM if you have specific questions, because maybe I'll answer them on the podcast. Maybe I will invite you to talk about them on this show, because I think it's really cool to hear everybody's different questions, because again, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that the more we explore these together as a community, the better that all of us will benefit from everybody's ideas and different ways of thinking about content. But again, go to the show notes, crystalprofit.com/episode 301 to check out everything that we talked about today. But that's all I have for you. If you're brand new around here, make sure you hit the subscribe or follow button. And I would love it if you would leave us a rating and review. You can leave us a star rating between 1 and 5 stars. And I would love for you to tell us what you think about this show. But as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, "Send Crystal a text message." And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, "Send Crystal a text message." And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.